You're listening to the Barbell Life. On this episode, we talked to Dr. Stu McGill. Now, he's pretty much accepted to be the world's foremost expert on the low spine, particularly as it relates to athletics and training. And let me tell you, this was a monster of a podcast. Travis was incredibly excited to talk to Dr. McGill because Dr. McGill is the reason that Travis was able to come back from a diagnosis of herniated discs when people were advising him to just quit and retire or else risk paralysis. And then Travis used Dr. McGill's principles to get back and eventually break world records. And let me tell you, Dr. McGill just blew us away. So if you want to hear about how to get strong and avoid back pain or an injury, you will definitely want to give this one a listen. We just scratched the surface here in this podcast, so if you want to learn more, you can check out Travis's resource, No Weaknesses, which is all about assessing muscular imbalances and asymmetries and then coming up with a plan of attack to correct those. It comes with a 30-point muscular imbalance test, plus tons and tons of more knowledge on recovery and protocols for dealing with aches and pains. It is the guide you want to get if you want to avoid injury, and you can grab it at www.mashelite.com/no-weaknesses. All right, get ready for a heavy-hitting podcast. I'm Lauren Pinellas, joined by Rebecca Tilson, Malcolm Moses Hampton, and of course Travis Mash, as we talk with Dr. Stu McGill.
You know, obviously in 2004, I was told by a neurologist that, you know, I had herniated 2 major discs in my lumbar spine, and he told me I was at risk of paralysis, and he was a good friend of mine. I mean, he was telling me the best information he could possibly tell me, but he said, you know, I should probably stop, powerlifting at the time, and I was so close to breaking so many records, and so I did my own research, and that's when I started finding out about you, and then I found a local, practitioner here, a chiropractor, who was another fan of yours, and between my own reading of what you're putting out, and of course Dr. Gray, a lot of people know about him, my local practitioner. Like, I was able to go on to break multiple world records, including Ed Cohn's being one of them, and so he's a 220 total, and so just so many things out there that are just crazy as far as they tell you the word core, number one. Like, I've been to 2 of your lectures from Perform Better, and both of them blew me away and just were amazing. But, the word core, the way people use that without really knowing what they're talking about, without understanding that it's the entire spine and the entire pelvis and everything that supports it. And hearing you talk about it in a way that no one else had ever talked about, instead of talking about crunches and sit-ups and, especially like weighted sit-ups, and you talking about don't do any of that. Let's talk about planks. Let's talk about the curl up. Let's talk about, heavy carries and doing the things that train the spine functionally the way that you would if you're a powerlifter or a weightlifter. It totally saved my career. And like now, here it is. That was 2004. Now it's 2000. Get to be 17, almost 13 years later. My back never. It's one of the few things that doesn't bother me, but thanks to you. So I give you all the credit.
Oh, thanks. That's nice to hear. Thank you.
But before we go on, I gotta say this: do you drink bourbon or Scotch?
I'll be really honest with you and admit I used to really like to drink a fair amount. And I don't know if you know, but I've had hip replacement.
Right.
And I had a very bad experience with the anesthetic. Now, if you talk to anesthesiologists, they'll tell you this happens once in a while. The anesthetic will rewire the person. And I think that happened to me. It paralyzed my diaphragm. I couldn't breathe.
What?
And then not realizing with the opiates afterwards. To make a long story short, the next time I drank alcohol, I was sick, and the anesthetic rewired me somehow and I'm now sick with alcohol, and yet I woke up and I loved and craved coffee, which I couldn't care less about before.
What?
So,
came-
as a matter of
Came
fact,
to
I
the
had a
light.
meeting yesterday with an anesthesiologist about something else, just some of our.
I'd be like,
our
can you
business.
wire me back? Is where I'd be at. So, okay, then prior to that, bourbon or scotch? There's a reason. There's a point to my story.
Well, I don't really. I'm a Canadian guy, so I never really had much bourbon.
Oh, so you probably did what, Canadian whiskey, I guess?
No, I would drink red wine, beer, gin and tonic, maybe I don't know, those sorts of
The
things.
reason I ask is you got the coolest mustache in the world. You look like the dude. You look like the tequila guy, the most interesting guy in the world. That's why.
Oh,
I
that
guy. So that's
yeah.
why.
He looks like Tom
Well,
Selleck.
talk to my wife. She'll straighten me out. I'm a pretty boring soul.
All right, so let's get right into it. We've got a lot of questions, and of course, Malcolm has got his own agenda. Like, he's excited, and so let's get right into proper ways to train the back, especially when a hinge is involved. There's a lot of people out there that would say, some people would say that there needs to be some flexion. Some people says not. So I'm just curious, whether you're a weightlifter, powerlifter, strength athlete, or whatever, how would you train? Like a good morning, for example.
Well, you know the answer, Travis.
I do know the answer. But...
The answer is it depends.
Yeah.
And if I could just back up and let's lay down some scientific principles, because you're asking for a decision and a judgment call. And I think anyone who can answer that just immediately hasn't given thought that will help everyone work through that answer. So let me start out with a couple of principles. If the athlete has a history of pain, the first question is, what is their pain triggers, and can you engineer optimal performance without picking away at that pain trigger? Because as we both know, elite athletes don't exist who are perfectly healthy.
Right.
They're the ones who successfully manage whatever that little history happens to be. So that's the first thing I would say. What that requires is an assessment of their pain triggers. And then my assessment, for example, would then look at their body. What's their body segment proportions? Where are their mechanical advantages and disadvantages? What can they employ to pull the most injury resilient, performance enhancing features together? Then I want to watch them move, and I'll be looking for energy leaks, which are eccentric contractions of the weaker joints, or joints overpowering some weaker joints perhaps. And I would then choose a training approach to really take the weak links out of the linkage. If that happened to be a good morning, then so be it. A good morning for me, if that's the particular exercise you want to talk about, is all about tuning the hamstrings and somewhat the glutes if you're a power lifter.
Right.
So I would do a good morning only to the point that they are used at the start of the lifter's wedge. I wouldn't take a good morning any further. I want maximum stiffness at that critical angle.
Totally
I don't
agree.
want any more hamstring mobility, because you will lose performance. So now the question is, we've got that idea of how far you're going to go over to tune that elasticity. Do you want a rounded back? Well, if you want to have the greatest resilience, I would say rounded to slight flexion is okay, but then you have to lock it. It will cause delamination of the annulus, the collagen fibers of the annulus, if the spine is under heavy load, and we haven't even discussed how much load is involved in the good morning yet, but the more load and the more motion, the more stress there is on the collagen fibers. and it's better not to move it if you are in flexion. So the entire motion would be about the hip joints and not the back. So if they started rounding the back actively, that's something that for sure I would avoid. Now, having said that, let's take the counterpoint. If you actively extend the back, if you can imagine what I don't know if the viewers can see my motion on the screen here or not, that will actually drive more neural drive to the motor units in the erector spinae. But do you want to do that on a Roman chair extension? That was one of Vasily Alexiev's favorite exercise, the great super heavyweight Soviet lifter.
Yeah, he was known to do 100 kilos like that.
Yeah, of years ago. So, you wouldn't want to be him as a 55-year-old because he was in a lot of pain. Right. But as you know, he ruled the world. And someone like Konstantinov, the great Latvian powerlifter, how he does the dive very dynamically, which is a round back good morning lift, basically.
Right.
But, he's that 1 in 10,000 lifter that somehow the stars have aligned and allows him to do that. The majority of people doing that will get injured before they get to maximum performance. So do you want to know a couple of other features that are so fascinating about the spine's ability to withstand that? Because obviously any training, it will cause an adaptation that's either strengthening and performance enhancing or weakening and taking the person down the trail of cumulative trauma.
Dr. McGill, could we talk more about that foundational idea of the back stiffness? When we talked about the good morning at the very beginning, you mentioned you were talking about maximal stiffness. And I was wondering, for our listeners especially, to go back to that idea, because I feel like that's kind of a really key point, that some people are like, I know to like tighten and to be firm, but could you elaborate a little bit more on what you're talking about with back stiffness and some of the useful points about it in terms of for resilience especially?
Well, I have a lot of models here, and if you can imagine that these are just balls with tubes and a steel wire going through. So I've created a spine there. Now that spine is stiff. Do you see how the spine will bear load because it's stiff? Now what I'm going to do is decrease the stiffness by slackening the rod. I'm reducing the thrust line compression down that spine. Watch what happens. Do you see how the spine is unable to bear load if it's not stiffened?
Right.
Okay.
No engineer in their right mind would build a flexible rod and then ask it to bear compression.
Right.
So the power lifter, the first role is to stiffen the core to allow it to bear maximum compressive load.
Right.
So we get into all kinds of technique where they will form a lifter's wedge. So right away, the first thing I would coach is to pull down and stiffen the whole core. Slide your hands down your knees, pull your knees back over the balls of your toes, take contact on the bar if I'm doing a fairly narrow grip deadlift, and then I'm going to use every trick I can. I'm going to start to bend the bar with external rotation. Now don't tell me the lats don't externally rotate the shoulder. It's not the point. It's more of a post where I'm pulling down with lats, which will strap and create more stiffness all the way across the sacrum to the opposite glute. But the more stiffness I can achieve, the more power that I pull through with the hips gets translated up that stiffened rod. If the rod bends, I've lost some of the hip power. So there's a start on the stiffness discussion. It allows the spine to bear more load before it buckles, and B, it contains the energy leaks to create ultimately a better lift. Are you aware that we were the first to film a power lifter while their spine was buckling. This was back in the early 80s. I was working with some very elite Canadian powerlifters at the time, and we were watching their spines lifting reasonably competitive loads, well over 500 pounds in any case. And this one lifter, his spine buckled. Under video fluoroscopy, which is a real-time moving x-ray, we saw one joint in his spine buckle. So clearly it was an unstable event. He had insufficient stiffness, muscular guy wire stiffness, and he buckled and became injured. So is that a little, do you want a general discussion on core stability?
Yeah.
I just think that we could definitely like work from that. I think for most of the lifters.
Let me may I put it into 3 tight concepts to teach it?
Surely.
This is awesome.
Okay, concept number 1 of core stiffness. Proximal stiffness creates distal mobility. Let me give the example. Let's take a uniarticular muscle like the pec major. The pec major just crosses the shoulder joint. So when I activate pec major and cause it to shorten, it creates arm flexion, distal to the ball and socket joint, the shoulder. But its proximal action is it bends the rib cage towards the joint. So if all I did was to be a bodybuilder, isolate that muscle and contract it, I would have a very ineffective push because my arm would flex, but my rib cage would bend towards my arm. It wouldn't be efficient at all. But if I could lock down proximally my core, 100% of that muscle activity now creates the desired effect. Just like if I'm going to pull on a bar, my glute obviously crosses the hip joint, as do my hamstrings. If they contract and bend my spine around, it's an energy leak. Whereas if I can lock my core, 100% of that muscle activity is directed to extending the femur and pulling the hip through. I'll get maximum power transmission. So this is the first principle of proximal stability to unleash distal athleticism. Number 2 is we do have this flexible column built with these blocks and the flexible discs in between them. Your spine will buckle under 20 pounds of compressive load if we cut it out of you. It has no ability to bear load on its own at all. You must build this guy wire system, and this is where some of the physios, I think, get a bit lost on their concept of core stability, and they worry about muscles like multifidus and transverse abdominis. When you measure each muscle's contribution to that guy wire system to allow it to bear robustly very high loads, the big players are things like quadratus lumborum, latissimus dorsi, the erectors, the full abdominal wall. So that's the second concept. You have to build this very robust guy wire system to allow it to bear load. Now the third one, I'm going to get a different model here, is one of micro movements at a joint. Now we're going to talk about pain. So when you flatten the disc a little bit, which every power lifter is going to do at some point in their career,
if they're strong,
going to flatten the disc a bit, and that causes micro movements. Can you see shearing micro movements in that joint? That will cause little pain triggers in people, and we can assess those very quickly by doing shear instability tests on their spine, and we'll know right away if those micro movements are triggering pain. If we can create a muscular girdle around the spine, it engineers out and stiffens those micro movements. So now when they lift, and you just saw the compression technique I was using, pushing the bar away, bending the bar, spreading the floor, all these coaching cues that I know you use,
absolutely,
adds to that compressive girdle, engineers out the micro movements, and takes the pain out of training. So now you have just opened up your training capacity and tolerable volume. So there's 3 starts to stability. But let me just give you one more. Say you're a power lifter and you're not using a monolift, and you take the bar out of the rack. And it's too bad, because this was such a test of core stability. It's neat that it still exists in strongman events or in powerlifting federations where you have to take the bar and step out of the rack. But in so doing, when you take a step, so now I've freed one hip, do you see how if I don't have core stability, this hip collapses in a bend like that?
Right.
You run out of strength on the supporting hip. You need a very strong oblique and quadratus lumborum musculature on the other side to allow you to create that frontal plane core stability that allows you to walk out with 800 pounds on your back, or it allows you to carry, it might be a barrel of beer or something in a strongman event. So frontal plane athleticism is absolutely determined by core stability. Frontal plane, number 1, no real issue. So, I know I have my people who want to challenge some of these concepts, but I really love to see all their athletes who are at the podium.
Exactly. I coach. Well, in America, like our weightlifting team. I don't know if you've did your research, but our weightlifting team. We're the arguably the best weightlifting team in America. Undoubtedly the youngest and best weightlifting team in America, and so including one Olympian. And I can promise you this is that we use all of your techniques in the way that we train. Their core, their backs. We definitely don't do weighted sit-ups and crunches. So
some people like them though for the physique stuff, but we try to tell them not to do them.
Yes.
The beach muscle.
Well, do you want to hear a funny thing?
Yes.
If you take a slender spine, think of a slender willow branch. You can take that willow branch and you can bend it back and forth over and over and over again, and it won't break. But if you take a thicker branch and you bend it to the same amount, it shatters immediately. Now, let me ask you something. Are power lifters slender-boned people like, say, swimmers and gymnasts, or do they tend to have a heavier frame?
Heavier frame.
So you see what a mistake it is to assume that it is a slender spine, gymnastic spine, a swimmer's spine, a golfer's spine. It isn't. It is biologically very different, and it has to be treated as such.
I even if I were a gymnast, I just don't see where that. I believe that you could train your abdominal wall in a much more functional and safer way, even for a gymnast.
Did you see Liu Xiaozhen's 180 kilo snatch?
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, but did you see his waist?
Yeah, it's not.
He doesn't have a waist. It's crazy. He's the tiniest. I was so amazed by that.
Yeah.
But he's able to stabilize, obviously.
Right.
With
But it's a small waist, but there's a ton of musculature.
You could look at it and tell that it was incredibly strong.
Yes.
So thinking about the different body types and different spines, how would we train our weightlifters and powerlifters differently from the swimmers? What are they?
Yeah, the pliability.
Sure,
that's huge, because for their long-term resilience, we see that with our young athletes.
Yes.
But also in hearing, Dr. McGill, and hearing you say, about treating that differently, I'm just curious specifically what you do in approaching that type of an athlete versus a swimmer.
That is a great question.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
You're the expert.
Well, no, I'm not. It's just anyway. I guess.
Yes, you are.
Yes, surely you are.
Well, if we talk about power lifters to start with, despite what some of your listeners will think, stiffer is usually better. So both the Olympic lifter and the power lifter are elastic strength athletes. And I don't think it's a matter of stretching for mobility as much as it should be stretching and tuning the elasticity of the body. So a power lifter doesn't want a mobile torso. They want hip mobility just sufficient to get into the lifter's wedge so they can get good contact and grip on the bar and then pull. No more. Any more mobility would actually be a detriment. So to train the core to become stiffer and stiffer and stiffer, it's not good for throwing a football. You will lose your ability to wind up, store, and recover and throw a football. However, your torso will be able to bear more load. So you're going to have to train it, making sacrifices for other kinds of athleticisms, but you'll be a better lifter. So heavy carries would be one example. For the front, things like stir the pot would be
awesome one.
A good example.
That's my favorite.
It's most, people say, well, what's a good core exercise? Well, it's anything if you're using the core appropriately. Heavy sled drags. And I was with Dan John a little while ago, and he does the sled drag with a loaded carry, all lined up at the same time.
Awesome.
I love pushing cars. So, I'll have an injured athlete who just can't get a couple of 100 kilos on the bar and get underneath it anymore. We go out front and we push a car back and forth up the street. And then they've got that tremendous frontal plane core stiffness going. Now I coach them. There's no core motion allowed. And when they get back, their hips and their core is they say they haven't had such a training session before. So to get out from underneath the bar sometimes will add a little more tolerable training volume, and I hate to say it, put on a pair of construction boots, learn to grip the ground, and then they say, well, I can't grip the ground. That's just an excuse for having soft feet. Stiffen the feet, grip the ground, and push the car back and forth.
No, I'm everything you're saying is I'm 100% with you. If you were to come to our gym, minus when it's super cold, but if you anytime with it, like we just did the American Open, and at any given time, if you would have visited our gym, you would see them outside doing carries, overhead. I mean, some of them do the handstand walks,
sled pushes,
sled pushes up a hill. So you would see everything you're saying. But what you wouldn't see by the smarter athletes, that is, would be like sit-ups. My question to you is, like, is there ever a reason, like, to do like a weighted, sit up? Like, here, let me preface it by saying, is like, I don't understand like the functionality of it. Like, everything that, as far as like in powerlifting, weightlifting, my whole goal is to remain in extension, or at least neutral. Like, my whole goal is not to go in flexion. So when I'm doing a sit up, I'm actively teaching my body, to go into flexion. So like, I don't understand like where that would ever, be a part of my training.
Well, it comes down to a question of tolerable training. Your spine has a finite ability to train. You can only put so much load on it before it breaks. And that's just a law of biology. It's a law of materials. So let me give you an example. Assume I'm going to pull on a cable across like this. So I'm pulling a cable across my chest. My spine has to support that shear load. So yes, the muscles are working, but my spine is being sheared. So if say I did theoretically 1 million of those, I would work my spine 1 million times having to hold that shear load, correct?
Right.
Now, if I did a side plank, I'm just how many places do you know where there's an assessment table in front of a squat rack?
Only yours.
Maybe
so if I did a side plank, do you see how the load is going down through my shoulder and down through my feet? There's zero shear load on my spine.
Right.
So now I've taken out all the shear load, but I've put in bending load. I could now have a colleague put a 100-pound sandbag on that side plank. I still have zero shear load in my back. Whereas if I pull 50 pounds on a cable, it's 50 pounds shear on my spine over and over again. So that's the difference between an open shear load exercise on your spine and a closed with zero. So do you see how I could you could tolerate 1,000 pounds on your core, on your torso, in a side plank, just in that posture, because you've taken out all the shear, right. and it would be so much better for your back than pulling 50 pounds across that way. So when we get into discussions about creating monsters and tolerable training,
trying to do, yeah.
These are the discussions that seem to get by a lot of people. Oh, bend over and pull the bar or do these kinds of things. Just wait a second now. If you can turn that into a 3-point bend, you just added so much tolerable volume to that piece of gorgeous machinery.
Right. No, I agree. So let's move into, I was reading one of your articles, and like it was actually, you were countering, somebody had questioned some of your I wouldn't say theories, some of your points that you use as far as core training. And one was like proper ways to train the abdominals, and you talked about flexion movement versus flexion movement.
Yeah. Well, I think that was motivated by a trainer who was on the internet. And again, I don't know where their expertise comes from. But anyway, they said, oh, I listened to McGill. I stopped flexion training and I got weak. And I thought, well, no kidding. You deserve to get weak. The person wasn't educated enough to know the difference between flexion moment and flexion movement. So if I just took my arm, for example, there is a flexion movement at the joint. I'm flexing my elbow over and over again. A flexion moment would be to hold 50 kilo in my hand and just hold it. Now, there's no movement, but there's a tremendous moment and challenge there.
Right.
So what I'm talking about now is let's do curl-ups over a gym ball.
Which
that would be a flexion movement over and over and over, bending the spine, which over time is like you can take your credit card out of your wallet. You bend it 1,000,000 times and it'll break.
It'll break, yeah.
So it's the same fatigue that gets into the collagen of your discs. So let's replace that now. Instead of doing a curl up over the gym ball, we're going to do a stir the pot. So now you get on top of the gym ball, put your elbows on it, and stir the pot. Do you follow what I mean there?
I do now, yes.
Yeah, hold on, a little thing just popped up. Yeah, we got rid of that. So you do stir the pot. Now, that is a heavy flexion moment. It's a huge abdominal challenge. When we get some of the UFC fighters now, the big martial arts guys, they, by tradition, karate training, will do 1,000 sit-ups every day until they're about 23 or 24. And then they come to me and say, my back is so sore, I can't train jiu-jitsu anymore. My career is finished. And I say, yeah, it is. So now you're going to train flexion moment. Instead of doing sit-ups, do stir a pot on the gym ball. And all of a sudden, that pain trigger of the repeated motion is gone. And they are still able to be highly competitive in jiu-jitsu by avoiding the pain mechanism. Keep the flexion for the octagon and they'll still win. Well, I'm going to give you two more pieces of evidence on this whole issue. As you may or may not know, the American military, all three arms, the Navy and the Army, and the Air Force is just going through this, but the Navy and Army had an annual fitness test that involved speed sit-ups. The clinicians, the physios were becoming concerned because there were a lot of people coming home from Afghanistan with disabling back pain due to training the test, doing the speed sit-ups. So my colleagues, John Childs, Deidre Tayan, good scientists, were at the military base in Texas. They took half of the guys going through basic training, and they did the traditional sit-up speed training. The other half never did a sit-up. They did planks, stir the pot. In other words, flexion moment training, not flexion movement. At the end of basic training, they found the group that never trained the sit-up had less back pain, and then they performed better in the sit-up test. So you can argue with me about developing athleticism, but I think that's quite compelling proof. Now, the next one is so interesting. We evolved, if you believe that, from lower animals. And when you look at the structure of their spines, like this is a whale spine, for example. And as you know, a whale does flexion movement and flexion moment of its big flukes. So it is a spine flexion and extension. Do you agree?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Guess what they have for a disc in their spine? They don't have one. They have a ball and a socket. What? That's how they can swim and have flexion movement. They have a ball and socket. We do not. We have a collagen set of fibers that those fibers, we can measure them. Over time, will slowly delaminate and fatigue. So here is exactly what happens. Can you see that little red imperfection on the back of the disc right there? Now I'm going to flex the spine forward and squeeze it to mimic a round-backed deadlifter good morning. Do you see the nucleus coming out and trapping the nerve root?
Yeah.
Now I'm going to lock the back in neutral, drive the compressive thrust line straight down the spine to mimic a locked back hip flexion movement. The discs now squeeze, but there's no hydraulic effort to create delamination and a disc bulge. So I don't know how much more evidence you want.
And a lot of people used to question some of my training because all I did was neutral spine good mornings. I don't do rounded back good mornings, and they would say what happens in the deadlift, if you get rounded, you'll be weak, or you won't be able to recover from that. And the thing is I deadlifted 804 with a perfectly neutral spine. So I trained it to not get like that, but if I ever got out of position, I felt so strong from doing, I think, proper movement patterns that I was still able to get back into proper position and finish the movement. I mean, even my squats.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Travis.
No, go ahead.
Is there one shred of evidence that says, because I just gave you evidence that you can train and perform better on sit-ups by not training them. I haven't seen this evidence that avoiding something means you won't be able to do it. Quite the contrary. You build up so much resilience in a safe way that you can then go into, look, life is chaotic. And there are times, there are some occupations, there are some sports where you're put in some pretty hazardous positions. But if you keep training those hazardous positions, you will develop cumulative trauma. That's why they're hazardous. Some people call this stretching. I call it jujitsu. That's how you get someone to submit. So, these things are continuums.
No, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean,
I'm thinking it. My husband Caleb, he does hardscaping for a living, and so he's lifting these huge boulders and in probably these compromising positions, but he doesn't go to the gym and train that identical movement. And what you're saying makes total sense. Making him stronger, lifting properly.
Yeah. Oh, that brought me back to that's. I'm glad you said that. I almost went blank. But what you said earlier, that the spine has basically I'm going to dumb it down, but has X amount of capacity. So if I'm training, these crazy positions that, that are, can be, tragic or can hurt us, then I'm taking part of that capacity away. But like if I never train them and I train my body to do functional movement patterns and I go on a football field and I get out of position, well, I still have the capacity to do that because I haven't been leaking that capacity while I train. Like Dr. Gray used to talk about the spine being, which is my chiropractor, I'll bring it, but he would say the spine is basically like when you're born, you have an hourglass full of capacity. And like when you do something, dumb in training or in life, that sand starts to leak out. So, but like if I do, nothing but, proper neutral spine movements during training, I'm not leaking any of that capacity. Just, what do you think? Is that simplified enough? I mean,
well, that's pretty wise. Can I make 2 comments?
You can. Yes, this is your show as far as I'm concerned. You can do whatever you want.
I just had a really good thought. Now it's escaped me. It'll come back to me in a minute. But back to Rebecca's husband there as an example. I had a paramedic here today as a patient. And, they have tough jobs. They've got to lift a 400-pound heart attack victim out of the bathtub. Then they have to pick them up and carry them down 3 flights of stairs. These are tough jobs. Do you think they can train that way and survive? No. They train as safely as they can and try and minimize those very risky exposures, hoping that they had enough resilient training and enough avoidance of cumulative trauma that they're going to survive. But to keep training that, and again, you can watch some of the gyms who train athletes, and I'm thinking of some of the MMA gyms that believe, man, you got to be rough and train it to the max every day. It's awful to see the percentage of their fighters that don't make the big show.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like football in a way, in the sense that when people always ask me when we watch NFL games, like, oh, could you have done that? And I'm like, no, probably not. Probably wasn't that good an athlete. But when I think about it, though, the guys who make it that far are the guys who just survived this incredibly daunting training philosophy. So, schools are getting better about it, and all the way down to like Little League football.
From high school, from Little League.
Yeah, they're getting better about it. But when I'm sure for you it was even crazier. But when I was coming through, I remember, at 7 was my first contact year, 7 or 8. And it was mayhem. It was like a massacre every day.
It didn't make it right. It just meant there's a few people. Another example, like you take Bulgarian weightlifting. Like people say, like, oh, look at the Bulgarians. They were so successful. Well, number one, they were successful in an era before the Chinese, and before even the Russians got better. Mm-hmm. And so, were they good because, they had so many, in Bulgaria, they didn't have the NFL, they didn't have the NBA, they didn't have a lot of the stuff that we have, And so I think they were successful in spite of themselves. Like, could they or did they lose a lot of great weightlifters to, crazy training, regimes? Versus like, look at the Chinese who are much, more
super meticulous.
Yeah, super more meticulous. They train the entire bodies. They don't just snatch and clean and jerk to a maximum 3 times a day. They actually do things to protect their body. Same as the Russians, have done the same thing. So like a lot of times, people will be like, well, the Bulgarians did X. Well, they did it in spite of themselves. All right. Go look at the people who are much smarter. Like the Chinese absolutely dominate the Bulgarians. If the Bulgarians were here, that same coach, Abajev, the Chinese would dominate him right now too.
And so, Dr. McGill, this kind of sparked a question in my mind about, for our youth athletes, it seems like a lot of what you're saying is make sure that the training is safe, and make sure the training that doesn't take miles off of what their ultimate goal would be. I'm also wondering if there's any part of your paradigm that is
there's that word you like again.
Paradigm, yeah. Any part of the principles that you teach that enhance their ability to generate force. And if you could talk a little bit more about that, especially for our young athletes, because I think a lot of them have kind of been through that ringer of let's just work out really hard, and now are kind of transitioning into this phase of I have a chance to be one of the best ever. How do I now maximize all the things that I have going on?
I think I know the answer, but go ahead.
Yeah. I think I heard 3 questions there. If I can just take that last one first, about resilience and whatnot. If you're a lifter I think too many kids, when they come here injured, I'll usually say, when was your last day off? And some of them can't answer that question. That's very telling.
That's crazy.
They think that more training will keep them going for personal bests. And no one has coached them in training cycles. And you must respect the cycle. You must finish the cycle with an appropriate rest period, allow all the adaptation, and then set whatever the goal is for the next training cycle. And that may not be to lift more. It might be to work on, say, grip strength, or the strength to recover from a misdirected line of drive. So they might be doing floor grip exercises, or I don't know. But so that would be how I would answer that for the younger ones. What was that first question again? Sorry.
So it was, how do you think about not? So what's the other side of the coin? So it was my impression from listening to you and kind of having some.
Train safe.
So yeah, what's the other side of the coin of being safe?
Let me make
it's training safe but producing force, right?
Yeah. Let me make a comment on that training safe. That's a lot of people misinterpret that, and they'll say, well, that means don't push very hard, and you do have to. And I said, I didn't really say that. Are you being reasonable in protecting the joints? That's what you're really trying to do. The hip, knees, etc. The neck. Neck, as you know, is very important for lifting. Protect the joints, but you still have to challenge reasonably the other body parts that are adapting as well. So, that's what makes a great coach. Someone who knows the scientific principles and then is a reader of men. And what I mean by that is, and I'm using, Rebecca, men as
you're fine.
Slate. But I'm quoting Vince Lombardi there. A good coach is a good reader of men. You watch their face.
Right.
You know if they're having troubles at home. You know about their sleeping. You know when they're irritable. You know when they're overtraining and they need to rest. You just know that because you know how to read a human.
Yes.
That's the side of coaching that will help you in your training cycles to know, let's have a good, tough challenge on this next training cycle. We're going to back it up with a nice restorative session afterwards, but we're going to push this one. So, it's that whole thing of, yes, be safe, but if you are going to pull out of your body, you have to play both sides of the coin. So that's probably interesting. But a general principle, going back to your young athletes, this is probably more for your culture, young Americans, say, versus some of the coaching philosophies that I know in Russia and Poland. There, I would say the gains are much more controlled and modest. So, if you've got a 10% gain, they might say, that's good enough.
Yeah.
That's good enough for this year.
Yeah.
And then, but the Americans will say, oh, you just hit a PR. Great. Let's do it. Let's go for the next one now. We're going to push. Rather than letting it settle and let all of the tissues adapt, etc. So there's one thought. And the other thought is, no one gets more load until they've earned it, with a 10 out of 10 lift. If they lift and you can score that a 9.5 because they had a flaw, they haven't earned the right to up the load. But some coaches think they're going to fix all of that by adding more load. So there's just another little thought. You got to earn your right to get your next increment.
I totally agree. We have a a phenomenal 13-year-old, arguably the strong. Well, no, I mean without a doubt after this American Open, but the strongest 13-year-old in the country. You know, he back squats, you know, high bar back squats 400 pounds at 13 years old with perfect form. You can feel free to watch the videos. Like literally zero movement in the spine whatsoever. But I mean, I could easily had him go up to 450. I have no doubts he would have gotten it. But like he's got a long road ahead of him. So I'm trying to stay at like an 8 or, you know, rate of perceived exertion with him, you know, because, you know, we're thinking, like I'm thinking 2024.
Yeah,
you know,
2 Olympics from now.
Yeah, so like why do I want to, you know, see if he can squat? I don't need to see him squat 450. I know he can do it, and that's fine. That's all that needs to happen. You know, him squatting 450 is nothing but a test. Nothing good really happened. He didn't get any stronger. He just demonstrated he could do that. I already know that. So I'm trying to like keep that capacity back. I'm trying to keep his body healthy and moving forwards. And you know, yeah, I totally agree with you. A lot of the coaches in America are so crazy. Even in sports like football, they're just crazy as far as the way they treat these athletes. And, you know, they're thinking about, let's see what our 13-year-old can do. I'm trying to think, what can that 13-year-old do when he's 18? That's the way. How can that 18-year-old do when he's 24? You know, that's what I'm trying to think like.
Yeah, I absolutely love listening to that.
There's
you know, you see who are the best athletes when they were 13, and if they kept pushing, they are not the best athlete when they're 20.
I see it happen all the time, you know, or who's the same guy, you know, who's at 20 years old. I've seen a guy at 20, you know, blow it up, and then that was the last I ever saw of him because he, like, you know, that was it. He gave all he had. But you know, there's a point I wanted to make too to what you know, to what Malcolm said as far as like how can you train safely to still produce force. That what I found is when I did, you know, follow the principles that, you know, Dr. McGill lays out in his books and on his website, I found that training safely equaled more force. Like the more stiff I got through like planks, carries, you know, stir the pot. I've done a ton of. I also saw. I'm pretty sure it was you at Perform Better. You were talking about doing planks with a row, with, you know, planks with the lat pull, side planks with a row, like you know, the kettlebell bottom up carries, like doing all the different carries. The stronger I got at those movements, equated to stronger. You know, like when I was doing bobsled, it equated to a stronger vertical leap, a faster 40-yard dash, because with my torso had all that stiffness. It allowed my, you know, the force that I wanted to produce in the other limbs to be even better. Like, I guess that would be the proximal stiffness equal the distal, you know, athleticism.
Yep, distal.
I mean, that makes sense.
I think it does. I mean, just being in the gym and thinking about it, and it's really interesting to kind of watch this culture evolve. And Dr. McGill, I don't know how familiar you are with like how our young lifters have kind of continued to progress at such a rapid rate, and just thinking about them for the long term. Just as a question of mine, because they're strong, and like you said, I do think it's part of the American culture. You know, they want to push it. They like to go really hard. They will take their lumps in stride and kind of just keep pushing through, and just being able to temper it in some way by saying, okay, well, what's the ultimate goal? Where do you ultimately want to be? And here are the things that we know for a fact can help you take some adjustments, take some like shifts in what you do, so you can better your process for the long term. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Any weightlifter that's listening to it right now, they got to think, you know, anyone who's of age, who's like, this Olympic quad is like a real thing for them. They definitely need to listen to this, because what does it matter what you're doing right now? Right. You got to be thinking, you know, what kind of capacity will your spine have 4 years from now? Like if you destroy it right now, then you've done nothing. So you had a great American Open. Good job. Nobody cares.
All right. You got to keep pushing.
Nobody's going to remember who won the American Open in 2016. No. What they will remember is who made the Olympic team in 2020.
Right.
So one more question I have to ask. Like, let's take a weightlifter and a powerlifter. You know, if they were going to, you know, you're going to have them do a squat. Is there anything different that you would teach as far as a weightlifter and a powerlifter?
Or even in the core strength or spine stability?
All the above. Teaching the movement, core strength, spine stability, yes.
Well, they're really quite different athletes. Do you remember the old Olympic lifts? There was actually 3 lifts. The press was in there, but that's now been taken out. And after that, the lifters really started to diverge. So the Olympic lifter of today is now this speed elastic strength athlete,
right,
whereas the power lifter is the stiffer elastic slow pulling athlete. And it's really very different. The amount of compression when they get in, so I'm talking about power lifters, to get down into the lifter's wedge, and not going to talk about differences between, say, a narrow grip conventional and a wide sumo, but they still have to build that tremendous stiff wedge.
Right.
And they're pushing the weight down, posting, bending the bar, all of these tricks to add more and more stiffness, plus the full body suits. These are all efforts to enhance stiffness. The Olympic lifter goes down into the wedge, but they start to pull, they shrug. If their spine bends when they're shrugging, they've got an energy leak. If their spine bends when the hips are exploding in the triple extension, they've got an energy leak. So that is, again, a very different kind of tuned elasticity, but the biggest difference, and why I would choose both styles of lifting to train for other strength events, is the neurology. And you probably know what I'm going to say now. I love and I hate Olympic lifts. I absolutely hate them when I go to certain training facilities and I see everybody doing 10 Olympic snatches for speed. Yeah. And I just watch their form deteriorate. And, they just, I can't stand it.
Isn't that how you get clients, though?
Pardon?
Isn't that how you get more clients?
He's joking.
I was just trying to make a joke there.
My job is to put myself out of business.
Yeah, exactly.
To be very frank about this. But now consider the Olympic lifter. They start the pull, and then as they pull the hips through and they've got to the maximum height where they're pulling on the bar, at that point, they have to snap under the bar and go into the catch. Or whether it's a clean and jerk, it doesn't matter. The point is they are now having to snap their body under the bar. If you're not fast, you will miss the lift.
Right.
In order to be fast, you have to relax your body. So the neurology that you need to be a successful Olympic lifter is one of supreme neural drive out of your brain and then supreme relaxation. Shut it all off so you're very pliable and quick to snap under and catch the bar. Then you have to have this supreme blast of stiffness to lock out under the bar. So Travis, if you are at Perform Better and whatnot, you've seen all my drills with Olympic lifters, for example. They stand and they have to jump, and I won't do it here, but you jump and you land on on a box. Say a box about the height of your mid-chest.
Right.
And the drill is the first time I want them to jump off the floor, land on the high box, and I don't want to hear them land. That shows me their neurological ability to relax. The second cycle, I want them to leap into the air, land on the box, and pound it hard.
Stiffness.
To show me the ability to relax, fly through the air, because that's the jump and relax of the lift, and then stiffen up right underneath it. And if you don't have that neurology, you will not be an Olympic lifter. And I haven't even talked about shoulder and hip mobility.
That's what I've been doing with Frank.
It's the neurology.
We actually had that exact conversation in the middle of a training session with one of the, I think it was, what's her name? Yeah, but we were talking with Frank. And we asked this question. It was like, because in athletics, they always taught us, I want you to land really quiet.
Right.
It needs to be super quiet because you want to see like your ability to control. And then we were saying, well, you want to be able to develop the force on the other side of that.
Yeah, I want to be able to absorb force. So I have one of my Olympic weightlifters doing what you said. The second, he's very good at landing softly, but like he wasn't very good at landing with that force and putting on the brakes. Which is what you need. You're right. Like when you're catching 400 pounds, you better have the ability to put on the brakes and stiffen up quickly. So, or else you're going to get crushed. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there's an example, I guess, of, I think it was Rebecca, you said, core training. It's this idea of speed training and on-off. We call it bang-bang neurology. That's very different athleticism. And, both you have to be a good athlete, but a different type of athlete.
Sure. Okay.
This is great.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. Well, hey, Dr. McGill, obviously, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous. And we talk about you like every episode.
Everyone already knows backfitpro.com, but
for the one person who hasn't heard us talk about that yet, just where do you want people to go to find out more about you?
I have to tell I've been a professor for 32 years. I retired on Tuesday.
Oh no!
Congratulations.
From Waterloo University, correct?
Right. So
awesome.
I taught. I was the first professor the kids saw out of high school, and I was the last professor they saw before they left. And man, what a difference! But I've done that for 32 years, so I'm done with that now, and I'm just going to consult and see patients and athletes, which is the stuff I really love. So the website is not the university anymore. It's backfitpro.com.
Yeah.
And
I've literally plugged you 10 times already. But go ahead.
If someone is interested in getting out of back pain, don't mix that up with training the back. They're two entirely different things. So if you want to get out of back pain, I've written a book that's very consumable called Back Mechanic. If you are successful, you're out of pain, and now you want to get back to training, but you don't want to go back to pain, then the next book is Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance. But with those two, I think there's a sufficient blend of scientific principles and then examples for adapting them to specific situations. So, we can talk about the sprinter, the powerlifter, the Olympic lifter, the quarterback, or the MMA athlete, or whatever it is.
Awesome, man.
Thanks,
I got to say, I want to let everyone know, what an honor. I've met Arnold, Schwarzenegger. I've literally had lunch with him before. And I was not near as excited. I'm sorry, Arnold. But when you emailed me back, I literally was like a little schoolboy.
He was like a badge for that.
I was so excited and I feel so honored just because you were such a contributing factor to my own training. There would have been 0 world records set by me had it not been for you.
Travis, we're going to go have, what was it, a bourbon or a scotch?
Yeah.
Or coffee, right?
Yeah, you can have a coffee.
I drink coffee too.
So next time we're at a meeting, whether it's Perform Better or at a sports performance meeting or whatnot, give me a holler and I'll buy it.
I will 100% take you up on that.
He's going to drive to your place tonight. Well, we were all so grateful for Dr. McGill's generosity in speaking with us and giving us his time. We were all blown away. And when he explains everything, it seems so simple. You wonder why you just didn't understand this stuff before. So thanks to him for being on. Again, check out more podcasts like this, tons of articles, and all sorts of resources for you over at mashelite.com. That's mashelite.com. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.